All right, let's try this again. Here we go. Okay. So we have finished chapter 9, which is all about different layouts. I went and looked in Pearson and realized that we haven't had homework in a while because we had like the E-Day and a couple other things, which yes, thumbs up, but bad for like your grade, because then the less homeworks I give you, the more dependent we are on the exams. So you will have a Pearson tonight, and it's all on the chapter 9 stuff. So it's kind of like a nice little summary of the chapter 9 material, because we did the chapter 9 stuff, and then we watched that video for 2 classes, which I use that video every semester, so that's good to have, good knowledge to have, but then this is kind of like a review assignment of that material, since I didn't give you any homework while we were doing it. Which means that we are now moving into chapter 10. Which is all about, in some way or another, human resources, like the jobs, another thing. Job strategies. I'll say I don't know how it's worded in the book. If it's job design strategies, but we'll go with that. Okay. So as we've been going through the different chapters, each one is a strategic area of focus for the operations manager or team. So we looked at location, we looked at layout, we looked at processes, now we're looking at human resources and the job design. So these are all areas of focus that are simultaneous moving pieces. You know, it's not like I can only focus on one or only focus on another. At any given day in a facility, you're kind of looking at any and all of these things, sometimes all at the same time. So what is it that we're going to look at in this chapter as part of this focus, okay? So in this chapter, it's all about managing jobs and job design, and we're going to go through some of the details of job design, okay? So that to efficiently utilize people. So in the last chapter, our focus was all about maximizing the space that we had, right? How are we going to arrange the facility? Where are we going to put our machines? Where are we going to put our desks? Where are we going to put different things? How are we going to arrange our cells, whatever it was, so that it lets us maximize the space that we have. Here, what we're maximizing is the efficiency of our people. So we want to be as effective as possible. If I've got a person, okay, I want to use that person as effectively as I possibly can, right? I want to make sure that that person, whatever hours that person's working or whatever the shift that person's on, I want them working, right? I don't want them just sitting around, twiddling their thumbs, reading the paper, outside taking breaks, chatting with people. There is some downtime for things like that, obviously. But I want those people working, right? If they're working, then I'm able to make a product or generate sales, right? So I really want to make sure that I'm doing that. So we've got to kind of consider what's the best for our people, which is you can kind of already start to think about, like when we're thinking about our layout, we looked a little bit at how many people should I have, what's the best way to kind of use them. So we're going to kind of tie all of that in. The other component of human resources is now we're dealing with people. So unlike machines where we can just say like, I'm going to plug that machine in and use it for 2 8-hour shifts, or I have first, second, third shift, so that machine's on all the time unless it's down for maintenance or repairs. With people, now we have a human element, so we have to also manage quality of life, okay, for our workers. Maybe we should say quality of work life. Maybe that's better, because I can't really control what happens outside of work. So we'll say quality of work life. So that means, you know, we have to create an environment or an atmosphere for our people where they feel, you know, comfortable coming to work, both, you know, mentally but also physically. So we're going to have a lot of different considerations that come into play. And human resources is a tough one. When you're looking at how you're best going to manage your people, there's a lot going into these decisions, right? You have to think about, you know, when we talk about location strategy, right? One of the things we said at that point was we have to have access to workers, right? Potential job pool. Are people going to come to us, or should we go to where the workers are located? When we talk about layout, we talked about, you know, should I have everything like in a straight line or like a horseshoe design? We're going to look at how many steps people are taking. When we look at lean, we're going to try to trim out the waste in time that workers spend moving between stations and whatnot. But then we also have to consider, too, like things like what is the machinery they're going to be using? What's the technology? What sorts of skills does the worker need to have in order to use this equipment? What's going to be the demand? So there's a lot of different things that are going to go into this job design part of the process. And then when you also throw in, by the way, you're dealing with people, and people are complicated, right? And you end up with things like so-and-so doesn't get along with this one, and this one can't be, you know, working next to this one, or they have an issue, there's a conflict, or these ones are, you know, there's just all sorts of things that the human element adds to it that make it much more complex, all right? So, as we're looking at how we're going to best utilize our people, there's kind of two schools of thought when we're planning our labor. When we're just saying, like, how many people do we need to staff with, okay? So there's two options here. Option one, okay, for staffing with people is that we follow the demand. Okay? So what that means is that we're going to match our direct labor to production. Okay. So direct labor means we're only including those people who we can tie what they do to work. So typically this is, not always, but typically this is hourly people. Typically this is your first level, not entry level, first level employees, those who are directly responsible for actually making product, or in retail for selling product. What it doesn't include, indirect labor, things like shift supervisors, managers, people in other roles in the facility. So maybe somebody in maybe design, like an engineer or an accountant or stuff like, I'm not talking about those people who you can't really tie the work that they do to specific output. So we're only talking about those workers that I can tie. So what that means is when I do this, okay, my labor is a variable cost. However much I spend on my labor force when I treat it this way, I treat it as a variable cost, which means the more product I make, the more workers I have to have in order to produce to that level. Now, the downside to this is when I make less product, I need fewer workers. So there's a lot of balancing that you have to do here, right? So there's costs, okay? So we're going to incur costs for, this could be any and all of these. Hiring, we'll call it terminating, which is a nice way for like saying firing people, right? Hiring, firing people. If we lay people off or put them on furloughs, there's unemployment that we have to pay into, right? If we have our production is really ramped up and we need people to work more, then now I'm looking at paying them things like overtime. Now I'm paying them like a premium wage, time and a half, double time, right? Whatever that might look like in whatever facility it is. So there are extra costs that I incur. But the good news is, with this model, I'm only paying for labor that I'm using. So in other words, I'm not paying people time and a half. I'm not paying them overtime if the production level doesn't match that. So if times are slow, I'm not paying people overtime. If I'm the smart company, I'm going to cut people's hours, have them work just their standard hours, or maybe furlough them or lay them off for a period of time. So that's kind of one school of thought. The other, method that I could use as I'm planning my labor, is to keep my labor consistent. So instead of the ebbs and flows that I get when we're busy, I got a lot more costs. When times are low, I got a lot less costs, kind of the ups and downs, In this case, I'm going to kind of keep a more consistent labor force, What that means is that the people that I bring in, I'm keeping them, right? I'm not firing them, they're not taking other jobs when times are slow, they're not getting laid off. So that labor force that I have is really well trained, so I can maintain my trained labor force, or my workforce. The people that I have, they're skilled, I've got them, I can rely on them, If I'm keeping that labor consistent with this method, then that means that I'm treating my labor, unlike over here where it's a variable cost, here it's more like a fixed cost. Because it's consistent. I know exactly how many workers I have, I know exactly how much I'm going to pay them. So it's a very predictable number for me to put together, The other thing it does is all these costs that I'm incurring over here, although I might have a little bit of it, I've got minimal amounts by comparison. So I can minimize, how do I want to say this? Costs I'll just rewrite it. Minimize costs to hire, I'll just put fire, unemployment, and overtime. It's just easier to rewrite them, But if I keep my labor force consistent, and I'm pretty even with it, what happens when times are slow? Now I've got a situation where people are underutilized, right? I'm not maximizing my use of them, so they're maybe sitting around, reading the paper, going out for their break and taking like twice as much time, right? There's not any work to do. Mike's like, what's the problem with that? I don't have any work to do, so what's the big deal, right? So I might have times like that, or the opposite of that is, if I've only got my workers for a consistent amount of time and things are really busy, then I might be overworking my workers now, right? I'm like, listen, you're only here 8 hours, but you've got to crank out much more than you usually do. Like, you've really got to, like, everybody's busy. You know how sometimes, like, when you're working, you guys have all had jobs, there are days where it's like the day might go by really slowly. It seems like you're counting the minutes, Or there's those days where you're like, holy crap, I just got here, it's time to go. Wow, that day flew by. That's kind of like some of what we're trying to talk about here, So, workers could be underutilized, meaning they're bored, or overworked if we're really busy. And these are all things, there's no right a wrong answer here. Realistically, what most companies do is some mix of the two, but not always. Sometimes they definitely follow one more strongly than the other. Some companies, especially companies that are, ironically, companies that are much more focused on like their cash flow and like liquidity, are sometimes follow this, which is weird because they think like, well, I'm just going to staff as the levels require, but then they've also got all these extra costs. So it's not necessarily saving them